Western secularism is a big topic. It's one that I studied quite a lot when I was particularly with Open Doors International, looking at trends around the world. And we generally thought there were 6 big trends that were driving the persecution of Christians in the world. And one of them was what we identified as aggressives. We said aggressive secularists are seeking to push Christians out of public life in the West. And of course, we compile, Open Doors International used to, it still does, compiles an annual list of the 50 top countries where it is hardest to practice Christianity. At the moment, there is no Western country on that list. But secular intolerance as an engine is already counted in particularly in Latin American countries, where it's extremely strong. But it is projected quietly, and more will be said about this in subsequent years, that a Western country will probably enter the top 50 in the next 5 years due to secular intolerance. This is our thought. So the question is, how long do we think it is that we will have the right to read Matthew's gospel from the pulpit and for no one to object that that's anti-Semitic? Because Matthew is very hard on the Jews. Very hard indeed. How long do you think that we will have the right to say that Jesus is the way to God? Or that might be classed as hate speech and intolerance. The question of how long is, of course, culturally, it's already quite difficult. But legally, it's okay at the moment, though the situation varies from country to country. So let me say up front that I think that we are living in a strange time right now, where for the first, really over the last 250 years, forces in society, and sometimes the state itself, is trying to take away our right to believe, which is the most basic, and it's the only unqualified right when we talk about religious freedom. Now, religious freedom or religious liberty, it involves 5 rights. One of them is absolute. So to have religious liberty means you have these 5 rights. The first one is you have the right to believe your religion. That's the right to believe. No one can take it away from you, even if your belief is that God is an angry, vengeful deity who wants you to kill all people from Africa. You are allowed to believe that. You have the right to believe. However, you do not have the right to express that view, because the 4 other rights of religious liberty are what we call qualified rights. So you have the right to practice your religion. Well, if your religion involves cannibalism, that right is not given to you. You have the right to spread your religion. You actually, proselytization, as it's called, and that's now a kind of hard or dirty word, is actually allowed. You're supposed to, you are allowed to share your faith. But of course, we have to share it respectfully. And then that's where the line of all these qualified rights shifts a bit from time to time, sometimes dramatically, actually. Then you have the right to change your religion. That's not a right that is much acknowledged, particularly in Islamic countries. You have the right to change to Islam from another religion, but rarely are you given the right to change out of Islam to another religion. And then finally, the final right is you have the right to transmit the faith or your religion to your children or to your dependents. Right? So that's religious liberty in a nutshell. You have those 5 rights. You're religiously free to practice your faith. One is, of course, absolute, the right to believe. The others will depend on the attitudes of society at your particular point and space as to how much leeway is given in the area of practicing, spreading, changing, and transmitting. So that's religious liberty. Now, where does secular intolerance this? Well, take a number of cases. For example, there's a company in the USA, and it requires all employees to sign a pledge. And it says, we will fully recognize, respect, and value the differences amongst all of us, including sexual orientation. Now, what the pledge is requiring the person to affirm is that all sexual lifestyles are equally valid. So when a Christian, a conservative Christian says, look, I don't discriminate, I will not discriminate, but you are asking me to say that I believe that all sexual lifestyles are equally valid. My faith, my understanding of the Bible, my living out of my faith prevents me believing that. So when we talk about the right to believe, if you get sacked for refusing to sign that pledge, that is an assault on the right to believe. That's the first absolute freedom. There's another case. There was a Muslim background believer from Iran, and he had pitched up in Germany. And he had been a very prominent mullah. He had been sent from Iran to evangelize among the Sunni Muslims in Iraq. And he'd become a Christian and he had to flee. So he ended up in Germany. And he was a very bold type. And so he discovered that in the summer, there's a 6-week period where Munich is full of Saudis. They come for their holidays to Munich. So what he did was he took a train down from Berlin, where he was living, took a train down to Munich, and he stood with a great big sign on his at the Bahnhof, at the train station, and he said, "I was a former mullah, now I have met Christ. Come to hear my story at 8 o'clock at the YMCA." Now, I hadn't told the YMCA he was actually doing this, but he found a group outside and he began to speak to them on the pavement. And by the time he had talked for about 2 weeks and done this, he had about 30 converts, who, of course, would have to go back to Saudi Arabia and keep the fact of their conversion very secret. However, what was interesting was that when he got back to Berlin, he was arrested and he was put on trial. And one reason was, of course, he had broken his pledge not to travel outside Berlin as an asylum seeker. So he was caught on that. But the other thing was, the judge said that you are speaking hate speech. Said, in this country, you have to say that Islam is as valid a religion as Christianity. And he said, look, I was a Muslim. I was trained to evangelize Muslims. Who are you to tell me what Islam is like? she said, well, I'm afraid that's the law. And so that's an attack on his right to believe. Now, the way he expresses it, will differ, but they're basically saying, no, you cannot believe that Christianity is a superior way to God and Islam is an inferior way, if a way at all. Now, again, it's an assault on the right to believe. So we have all the cases now, and you probably if you read the newspaper, you're always seeing cases to do with this. And of course, we have this big balancing act, because this is the nature of qualified rights. They're always balanced against something else, another right. So you've got freedom of expression and freedom of conscience. But we have seen more recently equality legislation trumping freedom of conscience. There's a hierarchy of rights in practice. There always is. But now it seems that the hierarchy is diversity or equality law over religious freedom, or the freedom to dissent. What used to happen in our country, we had the concept of reasonable accommodation, right? So say you are a Catholic adoption agency, and you say, well, our faith makes it uncomfortable and impossible for us to place children into the homes of homosexual couples. Now, in the past, the government would have given so-called reasonable accommodation for that. That's gone. The Catholic adoption agencies that hold that view have already had to close. There is less and less reasonable accommodation allowed. So secular intolerance, we're usually talking about two things really, and they meld together, and it's quite tricky. One is just, it's an umbrella term. It's the intolerant dimension of political secularism that wants to exclude religion from the public sphere. Yes, you have your faith, but keep it private. That's the idea. You can never express your faith at work or in society. And then there's another element here, which is it's the gender and identity agenda, or identity politics, for want of a better term, which increasingly says that conservative religious views are discriminatory or are hate speech. So it's these two things coming together that are what we mean by secular intolerance. And this has come a long way. I mean, there's three kind of tributaries. There's three rivers that have brought it about, and I like to talk about the 200-year-old problem, the 50-year-old problem, and the 20-year-old problem. The 200-year-old problem is the business of privatizing religion, because, as you know, in our own country, we were part of the wars of religion, and we fell out, and a lot of blood was shed over the meaning of doctrine and ritual. And when theocratic states, a lot of people get killed if a state is theocratic over what you believe and what you don't. And so in 1648, of course, this started to come to an end with the so-called Treaty of Westphalia. And this was the beginning of the state beginning to say, okay, we need to solve this problem. We can't keep killing each other in the name of religion. So what we'll do is we'll say the state should remain neutral between denominations, between religions. Because up until then, if you were a Catholic living in a Protestant state, you had to get out. If you were a Protestant living in a Catholic state, you had to get out. This began to change. And that's the beginning of this, what we call the Enlightenment, where they say, well, we can't make society run on the basis of revelation, capital R. We have to make it run on the basis of reason, capital R. So it insists then that the state becomes neutral. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. Actually, as a secular principle in that sense, it's a good principle, and Christians brought it about. But there was a slight problem that was thrown in here, and it actually came from a devout Christian man called John Locke, who had his famous essay on religious tolerance. But he described religion as an inward persuasion. And he actually said the only business of the church is the salvation of souls. Now, when you say that, you're basically saying, well, religion is really only for your own private life. It does not affect public life at all. And we would all, most Christians would say, that turns me into a schizophrenic. I can't believe this about Christ and how to speak and how to act and not take that in to my work or my job, or when I have politics or I sit in a meeting. Of course my Christian values are going to express themselves. So but this is the beginning of society beginning to secularize, and secularization as a sociological term simply means that it's just tracking this idea that fewer and fewer people are members or practicing members of religious institutions. But there's a famous book by a philosopher, Charles Taylor, and he actually says, the thing about the secular society is that it results in an atheistic brain. He calls the secular society as a society with the presumption of unbelief. And sure enough, I was raised in a very Christian part of the UK, but when I went to school, we read prayers in the morning, but all the teaching had nothing to do with faith. God was not part of the explanatory process. And Taylor's point is, what has happened is that atheism has gone inside the brain. And so the Western Christian has to kind of remind themselves to pray, remind themselves to think Christian, remind themselves to put God into the equation. It's not natural anymore. That's what he it's a very interesting point. But anyway, Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, he wrote a book about this not so long ago. It's called Faith in the Public Square. And he was quite interested to discover that if he was dealing with government people, usually if they were over 45, they were very pro what he could do. They believed that there was a place for religion, and they needed religion to help run the society. He said the under 40s or under 45s would look at me thinking, why am I talking to you? What use are you? You're just a religious person. What's that got to do with my job? And so he really began to see that he had to go back to first principles to actually say, you can't privatize religion completely. Religion does have an ethical understanding that deserves a place at the table when we do policy making. But that's the 200-year-old problem, is religion tends to get privatized because government has to run society now, not on the grounds of religion or religious belief, but on the grounds of reason. And so what tended to happen really from this period is that religion becomes a more inward thing and it gets privatized. Then there's a 50-year-old problem. I talk about relativizing religion is that the political discourse, really since the Second World War, has become a battle of rights. And this comes from the human rights revolution, which has been very good in some respects. But we have now what we call victim Olympics. And victim Olympics is where you get the most rights if you can show you're the biggest victim. And the issue, of course, is that the state referees all this. So, and there's this actual idea that's added into this, that the state should no longer be neutral, it should be religion-free completely. And this is difficult because you think of how much the church did in society. I mean, all the hospitals came from the church. Much of the welfare was done by these great Victorian philanthropists and so on. When the state takes all that over and then says, yeah, but religion's got to get out because we're the state, that's a huge chunk of society suddenly that has lost its anchoring in its faith, in faith. And so we've got this equality legislation, and we've got, the headlines are over the more recent things about LGBTQI, transgender, this kind of thing. And the view very often that is expressed by these particular minorities is that religion is something that inherently oppresses. And to have your right as a transgender person, for example, is to, you need to fight religion. And there's no question, therefore, that if the two clash, government referees, but we're back to this hierarchy of rights business. And then there's a 20-year-old problem, which is problematizing religion. This really came significantly from 9/11. And you got atheists, rather hysterical atheists like Richard Dawkins, saying, see, this is what religion does. A religious person, doesn't matter whether they're Muslim, Baha'i, Christian, they're only one voice away from flying a plane into a building and killing people. And so the God delusion, of course, was his effort to try to push, to say religion is a problem, it's irrational, it's intolerant, it's anti-scientific. We should be doing everything we can to sweep it away. And of course, I mean, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this when we come to Q&As. Has Dawkins won in this respect? I mean, I think in some ways he hasn't carried the academy because he's too extreme. But I think if you were to do a vox pop, around a street in Gloucester or Cheltenham or something like that, you say, what do you think of religion? I think a lot of the time you'd hear somebody say, just causes wars, doesn't it? And so the speed of all this, I think, has taken Christians a bit by surprise. So that we wonder now, some of us, whether our state is hospitable to the exercise of the Christian faith, at least a conservative version of the Christian faith. A liberal Christian, in a sense, has no problem with this. They don't necessarily believe in evangelism at all. But if you believe in evangelism, that there is a way available to us in Christ that is not available in any other religion, that's what causes this new friction. And this is you're getting a chilling effect. Now, the big case that really blew this up was Rocco Buttiglione. I don't know if you remember that name, Rocco Buttiglione. This was 2004. Italy was nominating, giving their pick for the EU Justice Commissioner. And they chose this famous judge called Rocco Buttiglione. He was a Catholic Christian. And normally, at the hearing, you're waved through. This time, however, he was asked, what are your private views about homosexuality as a Catholic? And he said, well, my private views are that I think it's a sin to be a practicing homosexual. But he said that would not stop me defending their rights under the law. However, he was rejected by the committee on grounds that he was intolerant. So what was interesting is it's a real double standard, this, because it says we would trust an atheist to protect the rights of Christians, but we won't trust a Christian to protect the rights of atheists or people of different sects. This is they would never have said that if he'd been Muslim either, because then they would have been charged with homophobia, Islamophobia. Now, this became a big thing, and Pope Benedict got really involved in it, and he called it a neo-secular inquisition. And he has a phrase now which he talks about anti-Christian militancy in society as a result of this. Now, in our country, we had a prominent case more recently, and that's the case of the Asher's bakery. A couple ran this bakery in Northern Ireland called Asher's. They're not the Ashers. People think, how are the Ashers doing? The Ashers are not the couple. The Ashers is just the name of the business. It was a bakery. And a gay man came in and he said, I want you to bake a cake and I want you to put a very pro-gay marriage message on it. And they refused to do it. They said, this is against our beliefs. We know a bakery around the corner, they'll do this for you. But they were taken to court. And the thing was, though, this is what annoyed a lot of Christians over this. They were taken to court by the state, by our government, who used 300,000 of taxpayers' money to prosecute Asher's Bakery from the so-called Equalities Commission. Again, it's this equalities thing. And the couple, of course, who ran the business, they had to find their own legal costs. They lost again. And finally, years later, it went to the Supreme Court of the UK and they won. The court held that people should not be legally forced to promote a message they fundamentally disagree with. That's the rule. Now, that's being challenged again, but at least they won the case. But it all is starting to make people feel like, is our state hospitable to the exercise of a traditional Christian faith? Now, there are sources of hope with this. It's not over, it's not lost. I think some of this is actually reversible. Generally speaking, when Christians are taken to law, if it's a criminal case, they usually win it. If it's a civil case, they usually lose it, though. But that's a generalization that doesn't hold up in every single case. Edinburgh City Council, for example, just last week, admitted that they had breached the law by refusing to allow a Pentecostal church to use the Usher Hall, which is the big space in Edinburgh where you can have big concerts and everything. And Destiny Church, as it was, wanted to rent the space for a conference. Edinburgh City Council was told that one of the speakers had made certain statements saying that homosexuality was wrong. And so they refused to allow Destiny Church to have the Usher Hall. Now, they have since had to admit that they were wrong. And they said, we discriminated against you and we shouldn't have done that. I think there was they said, our council facilities need to be available to those of any religion and none. And so they backed down. Too late, of course, to have the conference at the time, but at least that was good. And people are also getting fed up with some of this. You know, you look at J.K. Rowling and the way she got terribly trolled just for musing that gender might be biological. And a lot of people, I noticed it was interesting, particularly in the press, said, leave her alone. This is enough. She's got a right to say this. Who is this brigade that are just trying to troll everybody and shut everybody up that sees things differently to them? So there is definitely a bounce back point. In fact, we're at an odd situation at the moment because the Conservatives in power have realized that there's votes in taking stances against these woke culture warriors. Although I'm always a little worried when government comes into this, because government's very blunt, a very blunt instrument. And I think also there's a sense in which Western states realize they need the social capital of religion to make society cohere. There's a famous sociologist called Robert Putnam in the States, and he talks about binding capital and bridging capital. Binding capital is where something, a belief, binds a community together. Right? We all know religion does that. You know, a Muslim community binds around its faith. But he says, what about bridging capitalism? Bridging capitalism is where you use something that crosses, divides in society. And on the whole, until very recently, governments think that religion is incapable of having bridging capital. But now they're beginning to see that it can. So how do we deal with all these situations? Well, I'm just going to ask you some provocative questions, and hopefully we can get to discussion soon. Let me put it this way. What would we do about this? What do we do about this situation? One is, I would say, do you love Muslims and atheists enough to let them save your ability to witness as a church? Because in this world where we have victim Olympics, the fact is that you always need an ally to protect your right, to fight for your rights. And in pluralistic societies, single communities can never win alone. You have to create broad coalitions. When the International Religious Freedom Act was passed in the United States in 1998, it was a coalition of Jewish activists, Christians, Free Tibet movement, and feminists who were particularly angry at China for all the forced abortions. It was that coalition that drove that amazing piece of legislation through. And so, in fact, what I would say very often is the person who's going to defend your right to believe and to express your faith in this society might be a Muslim. We had a case in an English town where the mayor decided to ban Christmas decorations and all this stuff. She said it's too Christian, it will offend the other religious communities. So the Christians said, really? Let's talk to the local Muslims and see what they say. And when the Muslims found out, they were furious. They said, of course it doesn't offend us. We like the fact that in public there is some religious content. So they went back to the mayor. And she backed down, not because the Christians had protested, but because the Muslim leaders had protested. And the last thing she wanted to be accused of was Islamophobia. But this is the funny thing about living in a pluralistic society. Sometimes the people that will enable you to exercise your right will be those who are rather different And I think the church needs a new rapprochement, perhaps, with the Muslim community in order to bring this about. Here's another provocative question. Will you stand with the new MBB church when it gets into trouble for hate speech? Muslim background believers. We're living in an amazing time right now. Probably for the first time in the history of Christendom, Muslims are becoming Christians in their millions today. And the interesting thing is, a lot of Muslims are already here in our country, but they're kind of underground. Now, the thing about this church is it wants to come up to the surface. And they're very bold. Now, they will challenge the Muslim community itself by speaking out against Islam as a system that prevents them finding Christ. Now, they will probably get called hate mongers, but they will be very, very important in the cases as to how the government has to decide whether they are right and they should be protected, or whether it is hate speech or not. The MBB church is going to really force this one onto the agenda. It's going to be a big story in the next 5 years. MBBs can speak out about Islam without fear of sounding Islamophobic because they're Muslims, they're ex-Muslims. It's harder to label them, at least, as Islamophobic. Then, will we pay the price to get informed enough to realize the fight against secular intolerance is winnable? We have to fight, and it's a long fight. Are we set up for a long fight on this? Shirley Williams once said that in politics, moral courage is rare, and it can only be sustained in a group. And she said, that's why I need the church. The church was a community that sustained her in the fight for the long term. Cases are complex. The Asher case is difficult to follow, and most of us aren't lawyers. So to get well informed is quite difficult. But the church needs to get into this fight, not exaggerate, but get into it and be in it for the long term. And here's another question that we must think about is, can we weaponize unity and stop the energy going inward or going inward inside the church instead of outwards to change society? The devil basically wants the church to fall out among itself. Factionalism is the great devilish masterstroke, because it makes us just focus on ourselves. All the energy runs inward. But the church will need to look outward to society. And, you know, what was that famous line from Leslie Newbigin? He said, how do you make God laugh? Tell him your plans. How do you make him cry? Think yourself superior to another Christian. And if the church is full of people thinking themselves superior to that group or this denomination, then we will not get outward looking enough to. And I would also add, you might get the story of the persecuted church to help you fight, because, am I still coming across? It says my internet connection is unstable. Give me a thumbs up if you're still hearing me. Can you hear me? Yes, it's good. Okay, right. The story of the persecuted, because there seems to be something going on in society where the biggest quest in society is to find the answer to the problem of suffering. It's far more important for people to get that one than the thing about science or anything. Now, if we can offer a story that meets them where they are and says, well, this persecuted Christian, they went through this, they went through that, they went through that. And yet they still say God is good. And that's really the story that the culture wants to hear. The culture will not come into the church to hear it, though. We will have to go out and engage it where this question is being posed. So I just want to stop there because that's quite a lot to throw at you, and it's good to bat it about. I think we'll definitely see increasing secularization because the state is significantly expanding its powers, and COVID, of course, has also accelerated that. And the state regulates more and more of human behavior, and so that acts as a motor of secularization. Demographically, it seems to be the case that younger generations are much more socially liberal, and they are less likely to practice faith in the context of an established institution of religion. It doesn't mean they profess faith less, although at the moment they appear to, but that's early days, and I mean, we've got to realize as human beings, we go in phases and stages. We're definitely going to see more secularization. So I would leave you with this. I would say secular intolerance is very powerful, it's very strong, it's been going for 200 years, it's morphed into another battle of the last 50 years with all the rights. It's also fueled by a kind of hysterical atheism that wants to say religion is violence. And now, of course, we have these identity wars. And what we didn't see coming, I would say, people in my sphere who track these things, I don't think we saw that secularization would be pushed forward by secularism, because that's what's happening now. And that's an interesting link up. And I think a lot of the organizations and churches are still getting their heads around that one. But they're on the defensive because it's come quickly, it's come fast. And maybe it's something to do with an internet age, that change comes faster than we can sort of prepare for it. But we're in the middle of that. And I would say secular intolerance, we are going to get a more secular society, I think, but we shouldn't set out to think this battle is lost. And there are, I think, strong reversals that can happen, though we'll need to be careful. What's the goal here? Steve Chalk tells this story in a Baptist church. He says, why do they keep all the old hymn books locked up in the back of the church? He said, I'll tell you why. They're waiting for the church to reset to 1960 so they can use them all again. And there is sometimes a Christian attitude that we'll be all right if we can reset society to 1960 before the sexual revolution. And that's not going to happen. I don't think that's a goal that is achievable. But there are achievable goals in this area. And we're in this war. It's quite exciting. It can be quite exhausting. And it can be quite bewildering. But secular intolerance, I would suggest to you, is not this unstoppable force. It can be confronted and wounded to the point of where its influence lessens and lessens.